Okay, this is going to sound completely bizarre, but the story I want to tell you holds the key for those who feel stuck, paralysed by inner conflict, or like they've hit rock bottom and don't know how to climb back up. By the way, my name's Hazel Gale. I'm a former therapist turned author and creator of the mental health game Betwixt. And this weird but healing story starts with the birth of a boy called Ferdinand the Faithful. Ferdinand grows up poor but good. And while on an adventure through the wild paths beyond the borders of his hometown, he meets another Ferdinand, Ferdinand the Unfaithful. Now, this guy is bad news, capable of all sorts of wickedness. Ferdinand the Unfaithful is the darkness to Ferdinand the Faithful's worthy, virtuous light. And eventually, both Ferdinands wind up serving the same king. Now, something you need to know about this king is that he's not doing so great. He's lost his woman and also his nose, and is generally moping around feeling sorry for himself. Now this bad Ferdinand welcomes as an opportunity. You see, he wants to get rid of Ferdinand the Faithful once and for all, because all of his kindness and generosity just pose too much of a threat. So Ferdinand the Unfaithful goes to the king and suggests that good Ferdy should be sent on a quest through extremely perilous waters in order to rescue the king's bride and return her to the castle. And just in case, he also puts forward the idea that should good Ferdy fail, his head will be cut off. It's a little harsh, but this king is really quite suggestible, so he agrees, and that's the deal. But good Ferdy is our hero, so with the help of a magical white horse, and against all the odds, he does bring home the bride. The problem then is that it turns out she's not actually all that into the king. And who can blame her? This guy couldn't be bothered to go and rescue her himself. He seems to be really quite weak and influenceable for a leader, and not to mention the fact that he's lost his nose and doesn't seem to care. So the princess takes matters into her own hands, and she beheads the king, promising that she will replace his head afterwards and bring him back to life, but of course she doesn't. And thus she vacates the throne for a new and better leader. Finally, the magical horse suggests that Ferdinand should get on his back and gallop around the field 3 times, after which the horse stands up on his hind legs and transforms into a prince. The end. If you're still with me, well done, and thank you for trusting me. There is a point to this, I promise. In her book Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales, Marie-Louise von Franz says that fairy tales, more than myth or religious stories, allow us to peek directly at the shadowy contents of the unconscious mind. This is because, rather than having been curated, prettified, or just bent into a certain shape to fit an agenda, fairy tales are old stories that probably started out true, but then as they were passed from storyteller to storyteller and village to village, they warped into these weird and wonderful versions of themselves. Over time, the specific details of the original tale faded away completely, so that in the end, only the archetypal content, that is, the symbols that had fundamental, unshakable meaning for us as people, remained. So if the 2 Ferdinand's fairy tales sounded like a kind of lost and found closet version of a story, then that's because it is. Each of those weird elements has universal symbolic meaning that speaks to your unconscious mind and my unconscious mind and everyone else's too, even if consciously it all sounds like a load of nonsense. So with that said, let me very briefly break down the chief symbols in this tale, which by the way will also give you a new perspective on countless films, fairy tales and other stories, so you can hopefully grab the healing meaning with both hands and put it to use in your own life. First up, the king. Jungian psychology tells us that the king archetype represents the dominant consciousness, the status quo. Psychologically, this means that the king represents our current perspective and version of self. So why on earth has this king lost his nose? Well, the sense of smell is archetypally linked to intuition, which we can still see in common phrases like, "I smell a rat," and "just follow your nose." So the noseless king, then, is disconnected from his instincts and intuition. He represents that state we all find ourselves in from time to time, where we're out of touch or lost, kind of going along with things but not really feeling in control, which is dangerous because it leaves us vulnerable. And so this is why the king is so malleable to bad Ferdinand's evil suggestions, and also why he gets beheaded at the end of the story, which is, by the way, a deeply archetypal motif that crops up in countless myths and fairy tales, representing the vital, natural cycle of death and rebirth of the personality. Every moment of growth in our lives involves the death of one version of self in order that the next evolved version can be reborn. And linked to that theme, we have the 2 different Ferdinands, the faithful/good versus the unfaithful/evil, which represent 2 conflicting versions of self. I shortened the tale just now for obvious reasons. In the real thing, their conflict goes on for quite a long time, each of them alternating in winning the king's favour. The big question, of course, is who will win? Will the slightly naive, good version of self who's trying to find his feet be allowed to fully develop? Or will the regressive, destructive shadow self finally dominate? And so herein lies the nub of the story. This fairy tale depicts inner conflict. The question of how to reconcile two apparently irreconcilable parts of the personality. Again, we all know what this is like in real life. We may know it, for example, as the battle between a burgeoning part of the self that wants to live a clean and healthy life versus the part that loves to binge on booze or cigarettes or junk food or whatever. Or perhaps you'll recognise it as the part that wishes to turn over a new leaf, ditch our slovenly ways and knuckle down to study or work hard, versus the part that urges us to slob out in front of Netflix and slack off on all the tasks we set ourselves. In these situations, which one wins? Now, if you call to mind an example of that kind of blocked scenario from your own life, you'll know that the answer is that neither wins. We often feel like the evil part wins because we're so focused on the good part and we can see it being sabotaged repeatedly. But the shadow part doesn't get its way either, not fully. Instead, we just ping-pong back and forth between the two extremes, feeling increasingly untethered or noseless. That is, of course, until the bride/princess makes an appearance. One of the reasons this fairy tale feels so weird is because it has such an abrupt, unexpected ending. We follow Good Ferdinand's development, absorbed in the ongoing conflict, rooting for his victory over evil. And then all of a sudden, this lady shows up and fixes everything by beheading the noseless king that we weren't even really thinking about. He was like a side character, but he ends up being the solution. Because once his head is off and the princess decides not to replace it, everything looks different. In one fell swoop, a new order has been ushered in. The old, weak and suggestible king is dead, which means there is no one for Ferdinand the Unfaithful to manipulate. His power is taken away and the conflict comes to an end. The princess represents an all-important change of perspective. She is the embodiment of unexpected creative change as a result of seeing the world through new eyes. And there is a lost princess for every single problem, every internal conflict. So how do we find her? Well, the first thing to remember is that she is out there. And we are not going to get anywhere if we just carry on with the fruitless battle between good and bad. But here's the less than excellent news. There's no way to fast track or skip the conflicted suffering part of all this and jump straight to the new order. Because the creative solution bubbles up out of the unconscious as a result of our experience of the struggle. As Jung describes in Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, intellect and self-reflection alone cannot bring us face to face with the archetype of meaning. This archetype, which hides behind the chaos of the anima, that's our princess, can only be experienced after reaching some kind of crisis point, where all seems lost and all crutches have been decimated, etc. In other words, in order to reach its resolution, the ego conflict must be completely lived through. And while that might sound like a bad thing, it's not really. Because it means that if you're suffering, if you feel lost, broken and hopeless, as we all do sometimes, then you are exactly where you need to be. Pain, frustration and that horrible sense of stuckness are not evidence of our failure in life, as so often feels the case while they're in progress, but rather an essential part of the process of change. Those feelings are the agony of psychological labour. They're what we go through in order to birth a new self, a new perspective, a new life. So no, you're not doomed and you're not broken. You're in the process of renewal. You just need to keep your eyes open for the story or the piece of advice or the unexpected moment that makes everything look different. As always, I really do hope you find this helpful. If so, please like and share the video so others can find this healing story. And if you'd like to take an epic quest through a magical world in the name of personal growth, then you can download Betwixt, the mental health game, which is available on the iOS App Store and Google Play.